Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु हैं।
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है।
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
लफ्ज़ सरी कदल तारान
आखर हमार मेल सन आखर हमार जोड़
শব্দই সমন্বয়ৰ হেতু
Cocktail rock, yakraise.
Thuhi inkung kay na siyam tu ani.
Ajrahana apati disale.
Grauthaining yaukrai.
Shabda setu hon.
शब्दां दी सान।
On behalf of our festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and festival's producer Sanjoy Roy, I welcome you all to our last session of this season of Words Are Bridges. Our session today is Ratna Dholi, the best short stories of Dhumketu, Jenny Bhatt in conversation with Salil Tripathi. Jenny Bhatt's evocative translations of the 20th century Gujarati short story pioneer Dhumketu brings his poignant and nuanced tales to life. In an engrossing session with writer and journalist Salil Tripathi, Jenny Bhatt speaks of the range of Dhumketu's varied oeuvre across his repertoire of more than 600 stories, 36 novels, as well as plays and travelogues. Together, they place the Gujarati Chekhov in the context of his times as they read from and discuss his work. Jenny Bhatt is a writer, literary translator, book critic, and host of the Desi Books podcast. Her short story collection, Each of Us Killers, was out in September 2020 in the US, and her literary translation, Ratna Dholi, The Best Stories of Dhumketu, was out in October 2020 in India. Her writing has appeared in venues like NPR, BBC Culture, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Literary Hub, and others. She teaches fiction at Writing Workshops, Dallas. Salil Tripathi is a writer based in New York. Born in Bombay, he's been a correspondent in Singapore and Hong Kong and was previously based in London. His articles have appeared in major newspapers around the world, including Mint and The Caravan in India, and has won awards in India and abroad. He chairs PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee. Before we move on to our session, we request you all to follow us on our handles JLF Lit Fest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on all our upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Ratna Dholi, The Best Short Stories of Dhumketu, Jenny Bhatt in conversation with Salil Tripathi. Over to you, Salil.
Thank you, Kritika, for that very kind and warm introduction. I'm here with Jenny, and we're going to speak about a man called Gauri Shankar Govardhan Joshi. Gauri Shankar Govardhan Joshi was known to all of us growing up in Gujarati medium education or in Gujarat state or families affected by Gujarat as Dhumketu. And Dhumketu is a comet, the shooting star that you see which lights up and illuminates the sky. And the collection of short stories he wrote was also called Tankha. Tankha means the spark. And Joshi, or Dhumketu as we should call him, was important for us as he's an extremely important component of the Gujarati canon. Short story, as we understand it, the short fiction, is crucial in understanding where he was trying to go, what he was trying to do. He was carving out the slice of life, and he was telling us what was happening and what would have required hundreds and thousands of words in a very short, pithy way, sometimes with a twist at the end, and sometimes not with a twist at the end. And he has been an extremely important writer for many of us. I mean, I was at school. One of the stories that I remember, it was called Bhaiya Dada. One was called Post Office. Post Office dealt with a man called Coachman Ali Doso. And if you meet anybody who has had Gujarati education, they would be able to start telling you the very poignant and heartrending story that it is about a man waiting for a letter from his daughter. Jenny, before we start, I thought it would be a good idea if you were to tell us a little bit about what drew you to write about, translate Dhumketu's work, and why is it so important for you, and why is it important for Gujarat and for people in India, before you read your own extract.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Salil, and great to be chatting with you again. And thank you, Kritika, for the introduction. So Dhumketu was one of those writers that, being Gujarati myself, I grew up listening to his stories from my mother. She was a big reader and she loved writers like Dhumketu, Meghani, K.M. Munshi, all the greats of Gujarati literature. So, obviously I was familiar with his works, but what really drew me, especially to his short stories and to translating them, I started that in 2017, was being a short story writer myself. I wanted to understand the literary traditions. I write in English, right? I'm an Anglophone writer, but I wanted to understand the literary traditions of my own culture. And who better to start than with the writer who's known as the short story pioneer in Gujarati literature. And the reason that Dhumketu is known as the short story pioneer is that not only did he write more than 600 short stories across something like 26 volumes, but he had translated also stories by the likes of Tagore, even Chekhov, and he was drawn to the craft and the skill and the technique of the short story as distinct from the novel. In his own introduction to his first short story volume, the one that you mentioned, Salil, Tanka, he writes about how people need to not think of the short story form as just a shorter version of the novel. His introduction is very powerful, and I've translated a section of it in my own, after my translator's note in Ratna Dholi in my translation, because I think it's a very important thing that he talks about. And during his time, he also wrote a lot of literary essays and criticism on the short story form. Some of those have never been collected in anywhere. I mean, they're just sitting in these, archived literary magazines. So anyway, so for me, it was really, I was drawn to him for multiple reasons. One is, having been introduced to him as a child as one of my mom's favorite writers, him being a short story writer, which I am as well. And then just the fact that he pioneered a new kind of short story during his time in Gujarati literature, different from what others were writing at the time.
We'll talk about that social realism later, but what I would like to request you now is perhaps read out a brief extract, first in Gujarati, and then maybe the same translation in English. That would be terrific. Thank you.
I will do that. And since you mentioned Coachman Ali Doso and the Post Office, which is one of the most popular stories, it's, I think, the only one that's been anthologized, and it gets taught also in the English version sometimes. So I'll read a couple of paragraphs in the Gujarati, and then I'll switch to, I'll switch to the English. So bear with me while I pull that up. Okay, Post Office. Pachli Ratrinu Bhuru Akash. માનવ જીવનમાં અનેક સુખદ યાદગીરી ચમકી રહે તેમ નાના મોટા તારાઓથી ચમકી રહ્યું હતું. ઠંડા પવનના સુસવાટાથી પોતાના જૂના અને ફાટેલા જબ્બાને શરીરે વધારે ને વધારે લપેટી લેતો એક વૃદ્ધ ડોસો શહેરના મધ્ય ભાગમાં થઈને જતો હતો. સ્વાધીન અવસ્થા ભોગવતા કેટલાક ઘરોમાંથી આ વખતે ઘંટીનો મધુર લાગતો અવાજ સ્ત્રીઓના ઝીણા સ્વર સાથે આવતો હતો. એકાદ કૂતરાનો આવાજ, કોઈક વહેલા ઉઠનારના પગરખાનો છેટેથી સંભળાતો શબ્દ કે કોઈ અકાળે જાગેલા પક્ષીનો સ્વર. એ સિવાય શહેર તદ્દન શાંત હતું. લોકો મીઠી નિદ્રામાં ઘોરતા હતા અને શિયાળાની ઠંડીથી રાત્રિ વધારે ગાઢ બનતી હતી. કહે નહીં, છતાં કતલ કરી નાખે એવી મીઠા મનુષ્યના સ્વભાવ જેવી શિયાળાની ઠંડી કાતલ હથિયારની માફક પોતાનો કાબુ સર્વત્ર ફેલાવી રહી હતી. વૃદ્ધ ડોસો ધ્રુજતો ને શાંત રીતે ડગમગ ચાલતો શહેરના દરવાજા બહાર થઈ એક સીધી સડક પર આવી પહોંચ્યો ને ધીમે ધીમે પોતાની જૂની ડાંગના ટેકાથી આગળ વધ્યો. સડકની એક બાજુ ઝાડોની હાર હતી ને બીજી બાજુ શહેરનો બાગ હતો. અહીં ઠંડી વધારે હતી ને રાત્રિ વધારે શીમળી બનતી હતી. પવન સોસરવો નીકળી જતો હતો ને શુક્રના તારાનું મીઠું તેજ બરફ પડે તેમ પૃથ્વી ઉપર ઠંડીના કટકા જેવું પડતું હતું. જ્યાં બાગનો છેડો હતો ત્યાં છેલ્લામાં છેલ્લી ઢબનું એક રોનકદાર મકાન હતું ને તેની બંધ બારી તથા બારણામાંથી દીવાનો ઉજાસ બહાર પડતો હતો. I'll stop there. And I'll switch to...
Let's get it in English, yes.
Yes, yeah. The post office. The hazy dawn sky was glittering with the previous night's stars, big and small, like happy memories shimmering in a person's life. Wrapping his old tattered shirt tighter around his body to protect against the blasting wind, an old man was making his way through the center of the city. At this time, the unrestrained rhythmic sounds of mills grinding, along with the delicate voices of women, could be heard from many homes. The odd dog's bark, some early riser's footsteps heard from a distance, or some prematurely awakened bird's tone. Except for these, the city was entirely silent. People were snoring in sweet slumber, and the night was more dense thanks to the cold of winter. Bearing the pleasing temperament of a man who can kill without uttering a word, the cold was spreading its tentacles all over like a deadly weapon. Shivering and tottering quietly, the old man exited the city's gates to reach a straight path and slowly continued walking with the support of his old stick. On one side of the street was a row of trees, while the city gardens stood on the other. Here it was more chilly, and the night was more velvety. The wind pierced right through, and the fine brilliance of the morning star Venus fell on earth like an icy flake of falling snow. At the very end, near the edge of the gardens, there was a beautiful building, and lamplight was spilling from its closed windows and door. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
That was the, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating story, of course, Jenny, as you write about it. Basically, it's about an old man who's waiting for a letter from his daughter who was married and gone away, and it's a beautiful story indeed. Yeah. So tell me, I mean, but my first question to you, Jenny, is that he was very good at writing stories and making very vivid characters who you would not normally think about from a middle class point of view. His readership was largely middle class, of course. I mean, he taught at a school which was, where middle class children went, but yet he was able to transcend it. And of course, the age of Gandhi becomes very important because he was, he died in 1965. So he was very much a young adult and an adult during the Gandhian period. So tell me a little bit about his sensibility and sensitivity towards the people that people who are not normally part of the day-to-day existence of the kind of people that he had as readers.
Yeah, so you're right to say that, he was middle class, he was educated. He actually held several different kinds of jobs before he turned to writing full-time. He'd been a post office employee, a school teacher, and even a private tutor, sort of, to a rich nobleman's wife. So he certainly had his privileges. And as you rightly said, he was coming of age in the 20s, in 1920s, at a time when India's nationalism and freedom struggle and independence fervor was almost at its highest. Gandhian idealism had totally permeated certainly Gujarati literature at the time. You've obviously heard of the phrase Gujaratni Asmita, and writers like K.M. Munshi were very good they were good skilled orators as well as writers, as you know, and they were out there, trying to rally people and get them to support the cause. Now, during a time like that, most of the literature that was getting written was either historical literature to kind of make people proud about their own history, separate from colonial history, or stories, folk tales, and stories with messages, moral messages. And it was in a time like that where Dhumketu came along, and he felt that the lower levels of society, whether it was class or caste, were not getting represented very well in literature. And he writes about this in his own memoirs, where he discusses his journey from, to becoming a writer. They're called Jivan Panth and Jivan Rang. And he writes about how he felt that they were either being caricatured or being neglected totally, that we weren't writing about the real people out there. And so, he spent a lot of time in his jobs as a post office employee and even as the school teacher. He spent a lot of time in villages. So he was around these people a lot. He was also, I forget the exact year, I think 1918 or something, but he was a young man at the time when the Spanish flu had hit. And he writes in his memoir, which I'd love to translate because of this pandemic time, which I haven't gotten around to, but he writes, there's a whole 5 or 6 pages where he writes about the village that he's living in at the time and how an entire family living next door dies in a single day because of this, the pandemic at the time, and how he has gone to help and he tries to do what he can, but then, he's not able to, he himself gets sick for a while. So anyway, so he was living among the folks that he felt were not getting represented. And I think that's what he set out to do with social realism. He was also influenced, of course, by Western short story writers who were beginning to get more translated more and more into Indian languages right around then. So Chekhov, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Maupassant, a lot of these writers were being translated into Gujarati around that time. Although, of course, he read English very well and he did translate from English to Gujarati himself. So yeah, those were some of the different factors that came into play for Dhumketu wanting to, shine a light on sections of society that he felt were not being adequately, looked at.
So tell me about his multilingual aspect, because of course he knew English and he has also translated from Bengali. So I mean, yes. Was he a polymath? Was he a genius? What was it?
I think he was. I mean, I don't, we don't think of him that way, but when I read about all the work that he did, not only did he do translation, he was a literary critic and he wrote quite a bit of literary criticism. He moved around in certain social circles once he finally settled in Ahmedabad, where he was among the art crowd. And so he got to go to live performances, music performances, and to art, artists. And that was his milieu after a certain point, once he became a full-time writer. So certainly he was exposed to more cultures across India beyond Gujarati culture.
That's what,
and we have to remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have to remember that. He was also Meghani's counterpart, right? He knew Meghani. In fact, there's accounts of him and Meghani in his own memoir about how he met him, and he was, taken by the work that Meghani was doing with the oral traditions. And Meghani himself was connected to Tagore. And Meghani had lived in, Calcutta and in Shantiniketan. So, I think there was this whole confluence of cultures coming together and influencing Gujarati culture at the time, as you probably know, But so I think to me, he was a polymath. He was also very much into history. Of all the novels that he's written, I think a majority of them are historical novels. More so than social realism. I think he kept his social realism more for the short stories, but the historical novels, which cover the Chalukya Yuga and Gupta Yuga and all those periods, and he did a lot of research for them. There are extensive footnotes in these
Yeah,
novels.
that's the interesting part, that in his fiction he has footnotes, which is quite right. I mean, one should never assume that the what's being written that the reader already knows. And Meghani, of course, for listeners and viewers who may not be familiar, is Jhaverchand Meghani, who was the master of the folk literature, and he Saurashtrani Rasdhar and all those wonderful and so many songs, so many works, and also great editor of Full Chab and so on.
Yes.
And went to Bengal and studied there. And Mahatma Gandhi actually called him Rashtriya Shayar, just as Tagore was a national poet. When of course Gandhi goes to the Round Table Conference, there's a famous poem Meghani writes called Chello Katoro Jherno Api Jajo Bapu, that this is the last poison chalice you have to drink, so drink it, but after that come back and fight the struggle for freedom. So that's the fervor you're talking about. And
yes.
But Jenny, you touched on this one point which is worth noting, the fact that he wrote about parts beyond Gujarat. And that's important. So much of Gujarati fiction and writing tends to be rooted either in the region and the province, or maybe Bombay, because so much, Saraswati Chandra, so much of that takes place actually in Bombay. And because Bombay was a Gujarati city in many ways. I mean, people tend to forget that, but it was a very, very Gujarati city. But with Dhumketu, we find his fiction going to Karnataka, to Bihar, Amrapali, and so on, and other parts of India. So what accounts for that? I mean, is that, was he the first national Gujarati writer?
Well, that's a great way of saying it. I hadn't quite coined that, but I'm glad you did. I think you're probably right. He traveled a lot. He had the travel bug. He wrote travelogues as well of his travels and lots of travel essays. He loved the Northeast. There are several stories in his collections set in the Northeast, set in Karnataka, as you said. There's even a couple set in Kashmir, right up north. And then, as you said, he went to, ancient Vaishali, Bihar, that part of India. So he definitely ventured beyond the borders of Gujarat with his fiction and his nonfiction. So I feel like in his case, it was, the travel bug fed the writing, and then the writing kind of inspired him to go travel more. And he wrote about the characters, like Queen of Nepal is one of the stories in this collection that is set in the Darjeeling, area. And he wrote so beautifully, and I think he was taken by nature and by, the setting as much as by the people. And so he wrote a lot about, obviously, several stories. I've only translated one of those Northeast stories. I have one Carnatic story in there. And obviously, I've got the ancient Vaishali Amrapali story. But yeah, he wrote a lot of stories set in different parts of India, which is great. Yeah.
I'm glad you raised Amrapali, because that was my next question. You also mentioned the story about the Queen of Nepal. And, Ratna Dholi, one of the main, the story is really about Sundari in a way, it's not really about, Ratna Dholi is important, but Sundari, the woman that he loves and cherishes, is equally important. And which brings me to my next question, which is the treatment of women. He seems to understand them. He doesn't patronize them. He comes from a very, he's not, a metrosexual 21st century person at all, but still is able to understand them. He's able to empathize with them. Is there anything about his personal life which tells us why he had such deep and profound understanding of women?
Well, that's one thing. I scoured his 2 memoirs for that. I wanted to understand, because the memoirs are very much about his journey to becoming a full-time writer. And as you rightly said, almost all his women characters, even though they are subject to socio-cultural norms of the time, they tend to be independent-minded. They tend to be kind of resistant and trying to push back, even though sometimes they don't succeed. So definitely he drew the women characters with a lot more care and attention. He gave them layers and depths that we didn't always see, certainly not in Gujarati literature, perhaps, at that time. And I think, certainly he talks about in his memoirs about growing up with a mother who was a big part of his life, who was a storyteller. There's a whole section in his memoirs where he talks about where did his storytelling urge come from. and his mother features largely in that, and also Dalpatram and some of these others, Narmad, and some of these other writers. But yeah, I think he was just exposed probably to more women, also as a school teacher, because he was dealing with children, and he would deal with mostly the mothers of those children. So I think that was more his exposure. And then there was a stint he did where I think he was in Junagadh, and he had been hired to read to a nobleman's wife. They had a huge library, but I guess she couldn't read, or she didn't want to. I'm not sure what the reason was, but he was hired to read to her. And I think he, again, because he was in the women's quarters for extended periods of time, he was getting exposed to women. And again, because it was a nobleman's home, you can imagine there were women from all levels going in and back and forth. So I think he just had that kind of exposure. He was also in Ahmedabad. He taught for a while at Vikram Bhai Sarabhai's school. And I think again there, because Vikram Sarabhai was a progressive, and his sister was very progressive, right? She unionized the cotton mills. So I think again there, he was exposed to more independent-minded women. And, that kind of informed his worldview over time.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's quite fascinating. And I mean, you mentioned Dalpatram. So again, we should note that this year is the bicentenary of Dalpatram.
Yes, yes.
It's something worth noting, and, very important in helping Gujaratis understand about Gujarat because of the work he did with Alexander Kinloch Forbes.
Yes.
Yeah, their friendship, yeah. But that's a topic for another time. I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is his ability to, talk about class that he did not belong to, and the whole equation of caste. I mean, he is very realistic in his description of caste as a barrier in relationship. And, Gujarat hasn't overcome that. Gujarat still continues to get plagued by the whole notion of caste. Maybe you want to talk briefly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that. Now, here's what I always say about Dhumketu. Certainly he was a man with the biases and prejudices of his time. But you can see in his fiction, and especially as we go progressively, because I picked a story from each of his collections as he wrote them. And so you can see his progression as a short story writer as well, right? And one of the things I noted is how his own worldview about class and caste changes over time in subtle ways as you kind of progress through his early works and then his middle works and then his later works. And one example I'll give is, he was very much taken by certain themes which he revisited in different stories. There was the theme around justice. And he wrote a lot of stories that involved an upper caste and upper class person inflicting injustice or oppressing a lower caste or a lower caste person, right? And you see his progression where initially the earlier stories, the moment of conflict or the climactic moment is when somehow revenge is taken. Okay, revenge is taken on the upper class or upper caste person. And then over time, it changes to more about a balance of justice. It becomes more about balancing of justice. And there's literally a story called The Balancer of Justice. And so you see that his own viewpoint, it goes from revenge must be taken for something bad that happened to, well, no, justice, we must have justice, it must be balanced. And so certainly I think that, his worldview, as I said, he had his prejudices and biases. However, he tried to overcome them through his fiction by exploring the same themes around caste and class in different ways. As you rightly said, I also have addressed those issues because I lived in Gujarat the last 6 years after having left India for a while. And it was amazing to me that even now, when you're in Gujarat, and I'm sure you've encountered this a lot, is one of the first things somebody will ask you when they meet you. Well, they'll ask you your last name. Once they've ascertained from your last name where you kind of sit in that social hierarchy, then they like to know, what's your dad's hometown? What's your hometown? I get asked that a lot every now and then. Even now, some interviewers will, Gujarati interviewers will ask me, so where are you really from? Where were you born? And I feel like, well, but it shouldn't matter because I've moved around so much, but it's because they can put you in a little box and they know, oh, okay, and that still happens today. And in his stories, he has all these cultural markers, which I think if somebody is not Gujarati, they may not get them, but he has them. And I had those in my stories, in my, stories written in English, because that's what I experienced. I've got characters in my stories asking other characters, so yeah, what's your hometown? Or, hey, your dad and my dad come from the same village, even though they're both living in urban Bombay or, Ahmedabad. And I think, he certainly picked up those nuances. There are so many nuances like that in his stories, those cultural markers that perhaps if someone is not Gujarati, they might not get them. I know there were times my own editor at HarperCollins, who is not Gujarati, she would ask me, well, why is he so fixated on caste? And I said, well, there's a difference. He's not casteist. He's trying to highlight casteism. And that's why he's showing dialogue between two people where they're discussing, caste or what, So yeah, he was very aware of these inequalities.
A couple more questions, but one of them builds on what you just said. As a writer, what have you learned from him? Are there things that you have learned that you would like to implement? Are there things that you seek to avoid? That may simply be because of the time, that he's writing in a time that's no longer our time. You bring the perspective of a woman, he was a man, and so on. So I'm just curious about what have you learned and what have you chosen to avoid, what have you chosen to accept?
Sure. I think one of the things I learned, and one of the reasons that I went back to Gujarati literature, despite being an English writer, is in a way reading him and reading the things he wrote about gave me permission also to write about similar things. Because when I look at Anglophone writing, this is an old argument that, the richness of literature that we have in India in regional languages, we will never get or have in Anglophone writing, because some things just get watered down or don't come across. So going back to my own culture, my Gujarati literature was a way for me to see people like me and my kind, even though it was 100 years ago. It felt like, okay, representation. I feel represented, And so I certainly learned, if there's one thing I learned, I had already written on my collection before I started translating Dhumketu, but of course I'd heard his stories from my mother, right, but orally. So, but reading the stories, reading how he's done it, and closely reading for translation purposes strengthens my own resolve as a writer that yes, I must, and I will continue to write about these things. So in a way, he's given me this sort of permission. I don't know if that sounds right, but that's how it feels. And then as far as what to avoid, I think the only thing that I would avoid is he tends to, because he was writing again, in a certain style, right? He was in his time, he wrote in what would be called the Romantic tradition. And by that, for viewers, I want to add, it doesn't mean romance. It just means that he wrote in a sort of a flowery language, which, by the way, in the Gujarati, it works beautifully. And he was very much, he would often write about how much he felt that the Gujarati language, which is such a beautiful language, was not being utilized very well in literature, that people were not leveraging its full capacity. So he loved the Gujarati language and he wrote a lot about it in his memoirs. So I think he definitely tried to do that. I think that if we were to, in contemporary English, if I was to try to write the way he has written, and I've had to translate it, so I know, it probably wouldn't go down very well in today's, minimalistic writing. So I certainly wouldn't take from him technique or style. That's something I have of my own. But the themes and the things that he wrote about in different, obviously I'm not going to write about a village woman living in 1920, but I think he gives permission to write about those timeless themes.
Yeah, and many of these things genuinely don't change, as you know, at least thematically, they don't change. That's absolutely true.
I know, and I was talking to somebody else the other day, and I said, you know, Ratna Dholi, the story, title story, is about how gossip can ruin lives, right, in a small village. And I think about what Dhumketu would have done with a story like that if he were writing today. And, you know, social media does that, right? Social media is public gossip. That's what it is at the end of the day. And how that ruins lives too. You know, we've seen how social media has taken down celebrities and people, you know, well-known people. So I think he would have a lot.
I'm not that sympathetic to, because they are in the public arena, but it's terrible when it happens to non-celebrities, you know, to the neighbor next door, and even their lives are left in the open. I think that's the story you should write next. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's a good idea. I should. Yeah.
But I have another question going back to Dhumketu, which is about the way he concludes the short stories, you know, and anybody who has studied English literature would know about O. Henry and, you know, the twist at the end, which kind of, whereas with Dhumketu, there is a completely different approach, which is the open-endedness, you know, that you, and he kind of makes the reader work harder, you know, the reader has to figure out what has happened. He raises a question. He sometimes makes it dissatisfactory because there is injustice at the end of it all, because he wants the reader to feel outraged by that or do something about it. Tell me a little bit about how he concludes his stories.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point you make. So he was not a fan of the twist ending. There are some stories, not the ones I've translated, but there are some short stories where he does have the twist ending, but that's not one of his go-to techniques. You know, you're right that he likes to leave the open ending, because again, he was very much about reflecting life. It was about social realism. And in life, you know, the loose ends don't get tied together nicely, you know, at the end of an incident. There are always some loose threads. And so he does that. In his stories, he does leave some loose ends. But you can tell the skill of this writer, where his open endings don't feel like unfinished business. He achieves exactly what you've said, which is he leaves the reader thinking. And I'll just mention this because, I mean, he certainly did that to me, but beyond me as his translator, there have been a lot of readers. In India, you get a lot of bookstagrammers, right? So there are a lot of Instagram posts about Ratna Dholi. And I will tell you, the one thing that jumps out more frequently than any other comment in these Instagram posts, because they sometimes tag me and I see them, is the fact that after reading every story, the reader felt the need to just sit and think. They just felt the need to sit with it for a while and think about what they just read. And I think that effect is not something that can be easily accomplished as a writer. So certainly his endings are very skillfully written, to your point, the open ending, so that he achieves that effect of having the reader pause and think for a while about what they just read.
Now, you mentioned the gossip element in Ratna Dholi, and, you know, we've spoken a little bit about post office. We've spoken a lot around him and about him, but not enough about his plots. So my final question to you really is about Ratna Dholi. Can you very brief, because it's a title story, I mean, what is the story about, and what is how, I leave it to you whether you want to say how it ends, but if you can just talk us through what that story and why it is so important and the relevance with the gossip element.
Sure. So Ratna Dholi is about this young couple in a village. The titular character, Ratna Dholi, is a very skilled drummer and musician, and he's well known, you know, across the local area, and well respected, and well, you know, he's called on a lot to support local festivals and all of that. Now he falls in with this beautiful young dancer called Sundari, and they, you know, they're not married. Here's the interesting part. Dhumketu doesn't feel the need to ever say that they get married. They just start living together. And in that time, for him to write a story where you've got a couple just living together, sleeping together even, he even has a scene where they're lying dead together. So, you know, and then what happens is there is another character in the village who gets jealous of this couple, wants to be with this woman, and starts to spread some nasty gossip about her. Now, where Dhumketu, what he does is a little unexpected in that, he has, he has Ratna respond, and I'll try not to give away too much. He has Ratna respond, or Ratna goes through a journey, let's say. Ratna goes through a journey in terms of how he responds initially to that gossip, to then how that changes his relationship with Sundari, and then what happens after. And in that journey, we also see something changing and happening with Sundari. And again, I won't give away the ending. The ending is left open, and it's a beautiful ending, the way he describes it. More so in the Gujarati, I'll be honest, because just the way he describes Ratna, what comes over the man, and how he starts, drumming. I mean, I remember when I was translating that story.
You want to read out a bit of that?
Sure, I'll bring it up. But I remember when I was translating that story, I felt this would be such a great movie scene. It was just, let me bring that up, and I'll, let me just, in the Gujarati, right? You meant, Salil?
I'll leave it to you. I don't know how much time we have, so maybe in English, yes.
Okay, in English. Okay, well,
or maybe in Gujarati. Why not? Yeah, I mean, if it is.
Yeah, let me bring up the Gujarati. I'll just read one paragraph in each, and then we'll go from there. Okay, I'll start with the beginning. I'll start with the beginning. Amara evda nanakda pipaliya gamma bijo kon sangeet visharad avine beswano હતો. એટલે શરણાઈ વાળો ગણો, બંસી વાળો ગણો, સારંગી વાળો ગણો, દિલરુબા વાળો ગણો, કે વાંજા વાળો ગણો, કે જે કાંઈ ગણો તે અમારો રત્નો ઢોલી. પણ એની પાસે અનોખી વાત હતી. ગામને છેક છેવાડે એક નાનકડી ટેકરીની તળેટીમાં ઝૂંપડું બાંધીને એ રહેતો. ઝૂંપડીની આસપાસની જમીનમાં થોડાક છોડવા વાવીને એમની હાજરીમાં બેઠો બેઠો ઢોલ વગાડતો ને મજા કરતો. I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to come to the part where he meets Sundari. Okay, so let me see. અને એની આ ઢોલીની કીર્તિ ઉપર ન્યોછાવર થઈને એક રૂપ સુંદરી પણ એને આવીને મળી હતી. એનું નામ સુંદરી. સુંદરી જેવી જ હતી. અને એ ઢોલની દાંડીએ નાચવાનું કરતી. સુંદરીનો સાથ મળ્યા પછી રત્ના ઢોલીએ કમાલ કરી નાખી. પછી તો માણસની કોઈ બોલી એવી રહી નહીં જે એનો ઢોલ બોલી ન શકે. પોતે અણઘડ અભણ પણ બોલી બતાવે બધી જ વાત. એક વખત તો એણે મધ રાતે ઢોલ વગાડ્યો અને એમાં એણે એવા તો ગજબની શૂરવીરતાના રંગ પલટા આણી મૂક્યા કે ગામ આખું કોઈ બહાર વાટિયા સામે ચડવાનું હોય તેમ લાકડી, ભાલા, ધાર્યા, જૂની તલવારો લઈને બહાર નીકળી પડ્યું. રત્નાના ઢોલે તે દિવસે ભૂંગિયાને ભૂલાવી દીધો. So he's talking about, and I'll quickly read the English version. He was talking about how after Sundari came into Ratna's life, his dhol playing just took on a whole different character. Okay, I'll start real quick. In our small Pipalya village, which other skilled musician was going to come forward? So whether you consider him the Shehnai wala, or the Bansi wala, or the Sarangi wala, or the Dilruba wala, or the Vanjo wala, or whatever, he was our Ratna Dholi. But he had an extraordinary gift. At the very end of the village, at the foot of a small mountain, he lived in a small hut that he had built. In the land around the hut, he had planted a few saplings, and in their presence, he sat playing his dhol and enjoying himself. And having surrendered herself to the music of his dhol, a beautiful woman had also become his. Her name was Sundari. She was a beauty indeed. With every stroke of the dhol, she would dance. Having received Sundari's companionship, Ratna Dholi became amazing. After that, there was no earthly language that his dhol could not speak. He was himself uneducated, illiterate, but the Dhol could talk of all things. One time, while playing at midnight, he brought such a wonderful spectra of heroism that the entire village, as if about to rise up against some outlaws, came out with sticks, spears, scythes, old swords. Ratna's Dhol that day made them forget the bungia. And the bungia, just for everyone, is basically a type of drum that used to be beaten as encouragement for battle bravery. So it would kind of rouse people up, you know, to be brave in battle.
Yeah. No, it's just, again, the word that comes to my mind is vivid. How vivid its descriptions are, and how, and how they stand the test of time. I mean, that's what I was coming to. My one final question to you, Jenny, is what next? What are you busy with next?
Yeah, you know, so here's the thing. Dhumketu had such a vast oeuvre of work. I would love to go to one of his historical novels if I could, but I'm also in talks with a publisher right now about Meghani. And so we'll see, you know, which one happens. It's going to be one of these two writers for me next. I'd love to do a woman.
Meghani will keep you very busy because his volume is also enormous.
Oh, huge. And I know you know someone who might be interested in doing that, in Meghani, translating Meghani as well, but he's got so much. I mean, there's a lot.
Yes, of course, yes.
So,
No, so that's wonderful, and I'm so glad that increasingly we are getting more and more of the Gujarati classics coming back, in the public domain, because more and more people are translating them. Rita Kothari has been doing a lot of that too, and then we have Vidit Purut doing them, and so it's really, really good that a lot of the classics that we took for granted, but which we could not find very easily in other languages, are now becoming more accessible, at least in English. I mean, there are
and I think recently I just found out Subha Pandey has done Kajal Oza Vaidya's Krishnayan.
Yeah.
So that's just come out. And then I believe Rita told me that Aleph is going to be doing an anthology that she's editing, the best Gujarati short stories. And I don't know when that's coming out, but she had told me that was one of her projects that she was doing. So I'm thrilled too. I think it just brings a new readership, a new appreciation to Gujarati literature. And I'm excited for your book, Salil. I should mention for listeners, he's got a book coming out and it's called The Gujaratis, right? It's nonfiction. Yeah. And I'm excited for that book. I would love to get a review copy, I'll just say, because you're gonna be covering like the history of famous Gujaratis, right?
Yeah, it'll be the end of 2021. Yeah, it's a tough.
Excellent.
Trying to squeeze the universe into a small ball is never easy. I'm trying, But thank you very much, Jenny. And yes, and I look forward to more of your work and to see more wider dissemination and spread of this wonderful language that you and I share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salil and Jenny, for that engrossing session. Thank you all for watching and being a lovely audience. We hope you will join us for the 14th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival from 19th to 20th February 2021. We look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great evening.